Welcome back everybody to episode 3 in our programming subseries. So we're going to be talking about data types and variables. So in previous videos we talked about how a computer just takes input, turns it into output with the use of what's known as a program. So a program is just a list of instructions that tells the CPU how to work on what's known as data. So let's talk about what data is. Data is anything that can be processed and manipulated. So there are different types of data. For example, we have words. We also have letters, so just like a capital A, and then we have number data, so we have whole numbers, and then we have not whole numbers, so decimal numbers. Alright, so it's important that our CPU knows what type of data it's working with, so that it knows first off whether it can work with that data and how to work with that data. Okay, so let's take an example here. Say we have a program that says add the word apple to the number 1. So there's really no defined way to add a word to a number. So the CPU is gonna return an error to us and be like, yo, I can't do that. So that's why data types are important, and there are two types of data types. First off, there's what's known as primitive data types. So primitive data types are just the building blocks for any given language. So these build a language. And then the other type of data is known as user-defined. So user-defined data types are just data types that are built using these building blocks. So these building blocks are used to build those data types. All right, and then we need to look at variables. So variables are just how we store the data. Remember how we had memory, and memory is just a holding place for the CPU because the CPU is small and only works on a certain amount of data at a time. So our program tells the CPU how to manipulate this data, so we have to have a reference in our program of which data to actually manipulate. Okay, so let's say in our memory we have an A variable that's equal to 5 and a B variable equal to 6. And in our program we say add A and B. So this is our program, add A and B. So it tells the CPU to add A and B. So the CPU goes and gets A and stores it on the CPU, and then gets B and stores it on the CPU, and then it adds it and produces 11. So we need variables in our program so that our CPU knows where to look in the memory. So as I mentioned, there are two types of data types. There are the primitive data types and then the user-defined. The primitive data types are the building blocks to any language, and then those are used to build the user-defined. So I'm just going to list out the primitives that are common to every single programming language. So first we have what's known as a char. You can say char or char. Stands for character, and these are just symbols for letters, numbers, whatever you think of. So there's a character for the capital letter A. There's a character for the number 1. It's not actually the number, it's just the representation of the number. Then there's even a character for a space, so you can imagine a space in there. Next we have whole numbers. So whole numbers are using what's known as an int. This stands for integer. There are different types of integers. There are what's known as signed integers, there's unsigned integers, there's short integers, and then there's long integers. So the differences between these are the signed uses both ends of the spectrum, negative and positive numbers. Unsigned only use positive numbers, and then short and long, they'll have shorter and longer ranges respectively. Alright, the next type of primitive is what's known as a float. So instead of whole numbers, we're using decimal numbers now. And a float is, it's a decimal that can have up to 6 or 7 decimal places. And then its big brother, known as the double, is again a decimal, but here we can have up to 15 decimal places, so it's a lot more precise. And then the final one we're going to talk about is what's known as a boolean. So boolean is just a true or false statement, so it's either true or false, or you can think of it as 1 or 0. So now let's talk about the user-defined types. So one example I can think of is the string data type. So the string is just what we would think of as a word. So an example would be the word apple. That's an example of a string. A string can be multiple words with spaces, but we'll just think of it as a word. And really, all a string is a combination of different characters. So you can see there's 5 different characters in the string. And remember how a character even has a space character, so we can put spaces in there as well. So the next user-defined type I want to talk about, we'll just talk about really abstractly. So it's what's known as an object, and this comes from the concept of object-oriented programming and the use of classes and structures. So an object is just, it's an object that uses the template of a class. So let's say we have a class here that we write, and we'll talk about this more later, so don't worry about it. But in the class, we can have multiple primitives or user defines. So we can have a bunch of them. And when we create an object, it'll be unique, but it'll use this template that we created using the class. So that's as far as I want to go with that. We'll talk about it more later.